Education and the founding director of Western Washington University's Education and Social Justice minor. Her work broadly analyzes racial inequities in education, the causes of those inequities, and how they impact the educational trajectories of students of color, particularly for Latinx students. Her research is grounded in critical race theory, Latinx critical theory, radical and tactical cartography, and Chicana feminist epistemologies. Vero is the proud daughter of a Mexican immigrant mother and a Panamanian immigrant father whose journeys to provide her with a quality education fundamentally inspire her work for social and racial justice. Ready to give it up for Dr. Vero.
Hello, everyone. I have to admit, this is all a little strange for us too. It's so good to have, well, I had a chance to, I think, meet a few of you a few weeks ago when we had the interaction with a bit of the coordinating team and got a chance to connect with, with a few of the leaders that are part of the space. And it has been I've been so excited to be a part of this today. And I just want to thank, Tanya, Mary, Liz, Silvia, all the folks that have made this possible. I know that this is not, how it was probably originally envisioned, but we're going to make the most of it. And I think actually it provides some space for a lot of the folks that are online listening in to participate in their own way. So we hope that it actually creates a pretty generative and gentle space for folks to be a part of. So I feel honored to be a part of this. So for today, before I actually start, and I know that I was talking a little bit with the team beforehand and sharing a little bit about the protocols. I know that for me, as in the work that I do, and also some of the protocols that we have at Western Washington University, and also in some of the organizing work, we always are very intentional about first recognizing the land that we're on. Now we are in a virtual space, so we are probably on many different kinds of lands from wherever you're calling in. But I wanted to first acknowledge that no matter where you're calling in at this moment, you are standing on stolen, occupied land. So we acknowledge First Nations and the Indigenous peoples who are the stewards of that land who made it possible for us to even be here today. Now I start with this land acknowledgement, also recognizing that that has also become very much a part of organizing spaces. And we want to do it, we want to make it more than just performance. So what you'll notice throughout my presentation, and even as how I introduce this land acknowledgement, that we have to do more than simply acknowledge the land. What is our responsibility, especially if we're seeking justice, to think about our work in solidarity with Indigenous communities? What are we doing beyond simply acknowledging the land to actually change the conditions that continue to remain, the land continues to remain occupied and not moving us forward in ways that are seeking liberation and justice. So, so with that, I actually want to go ahead and get started and show you my screen here because I have a little bit of a PowerPoint. And what I want to do today, actually, as we go through this, is I'm hoping to engage you a little bit. So Silvia is one of my wonderful students out at Western, and Silvia knows that I love my PowerPoints, but I also try to do a lot of interaction through them and trying to share a little bit of the things that I've learned throughout the years, but also to try to engage you because you too are holders and creators of knowledge. And so this is, I'm hoping to create a collective learning space for us to think about. So the title of my presentation is called Curriculo para la Acción, Curriculum for Action, Popular Education and Community Organizing for Social Change. And I'm going to share a little bit as to how, why I picked this topic and why I think it matters for those of you who are leaders across our state and doing some incredible and beautiful work to organize us around different issues. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about strategy. So what is it that we can do? How can popular education help us in mobilizing and organizing at the grassroots level? But before I get started, I actually want to open up with a question. And the question is, when you hear the word curriculum, what comes to mind? So go ahead and type in the chat. I know Medi's kind of monitoring. When you hear that word curriculum, what comes to mind? Who can draft curriculum? Who's responsible for curriculum? Who can deliver curriculum? And what does curriculum mean to you? So go ahead and take a few minutes or a few seconds and jot some stuff in the chat. And Medi, whenever your things come in, go ahead and share out with us.
Yeah, some of the answers we're getting is white people and their structures and school.
Good. What else?
Send them my way. Educators and advocates can deliver and create workshops, conversations, etc. that can help liberate people. Academia, educators, guidelines, ways of learning.
Very good.
School administrators, usually set by standards.
Very good. That must be from one of our teacher ed people in the audience, or thinking about becoming a teacher for sure. So what I'm hearing is some of you on this audience already are thinking pretty radically, right? You're already kind of imagining curriculum of what it could be outside of this construct that we've defined as schooling. And I want to think about these two things, and you probably have heard this in other spaces, especially if you're already engaging in critical theory, that education and schooling are not the same thing, right? A lot of us were educated long before we even entered school. And our communities are filled with educators and people who can help us make sense of the world beyond what the state defines as a formal teacher. That doesn't mean my work, I'm in the School of Education, so I am in the, if you will, the area of preparing teachers, but I think of curriculum much broader. And imagine if you had to think about designing your own curriculum. What are the kinds of things that you would want to know? What are the kinds of things that matter to you? And and what would it take for you to actually write curriculum and to feel like you're an expert in drafting curriculum and putting together these things, right? Now, the reason that this is so important, and I'm going to keep coming back to this concept, is because popular education, which derives primarily from grassroots movements in Latin America, throughout Latin America, has been working to reconsider, curriculum for what and for whom. And how can we think about curriculum in our organizing work in ways that, sometimes I always say that, when in my role at Western, I'm actually surprised sometimes when I get students who are really from day one thinking really radically. And it's not because I don't believe in their capacity to be radical and their capacity to think around social justice. But schooling oftentimes tends to create very passive students because the state deems what is valuable. You have to take a ton of tests in which you're having to constantly repeat or put on paper exactly what the state deems to be truth. And so to create an active classroom environment in which students really see themselves as holders and creators of knowledge takes us some time to shift to say, wait a second, curriculum, there are many kinds of curriculum. And there are multiple truths that we can work with, but why have we only been thinking about one kind of curriculum? So I want us to push our thinking, and again, I want us to think today about what would it take in your organizing work and in the work you do in leadership to be a curriculum writer, to draft curriculum, and to use curriculum actually for change. And I'm going to argue that it's actually really important that we think curricularly in our work. And let me explain why. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to share 4 lessons of things that I've learned. I was a grassroots organizer working for 15 years, primarily with migrant mothers in Southern California and in Northern California, doing different kinds of work around educational reform. I've also been very lucky to have been mentored by an incredible mentor, Danny Solorzano at UCLA. And I'm going to share a little bit about how he impacted me in thinking about theory of change in this first lesson. But most of this work derives particularly from my work doing grassroots organizing. But the first lesson I want to think about, as we think about, us as curriculum drafters, as curriculum important to social change, is asking ourselves, what is our theory of change? Now, that concept can seem on its face very simple. It's like, okay, theory of change. So what is my theory of change? What do I believe is required to actually enact change? But let me share you a story. And I'm going to just share a little bit. Here's Danny, my beautiful mentor. I want to just kind of sidetrack for a second and just share that. So this is at my graduation from my doctoral program. And Danny was the first teacher of color I had ever. I had to wait until I got into a PhD program to meet another Latinx educator who really began to help me think about, because when I was an undergrad, I went through a very, very difficult period and I was pretty much flunking out of school. For all the reasons that I think I heard some, we have white stream culture, primarily white, patriarchal, cis heteropatriarchy kind of defining our experiences. You feel really isolated, particularly as a you know, as a Chicana coming up from LA, coming from immigrant home, kind of wrestling with my own sort of identity across multiple spheres, to find myself really alone when I got into my undergrad studies, and nearly flunked out, went into organizing work, and then came back to graduate school. And I never thought for a second that there would be a teacher or a professor that would affirm, you know, who I was, that I had something valuable to offer this world. And Danny was that teacher for me. And for the longest time, I thought that the reason I didn't do well in school was because I simply wasn't smart enough, good enough, I didn't work hard enough. I had internalized a lot of those messages. And so Danny really restored for me a belief that I had capacity to do wonderful things, you know, in the world and in my life. And so he was really instrumental in that. And in that process, he taught me this notion of theory of change. And he asked me, he helped me to think about, okay, Vero, so if you really believe for yourself that the way that you're going to get better is simply to study harder and work harder, then the change that you're going to seek is going to be driven by seeking to change people. Now, why could that be problematic? And how do we begin to shift the lens of thinking about how do we change institutions and structures? And what can that do for kind of, you know, for the kinds of change we seek? And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of like him, you know, how I'm going to give an example and pause and have you kind of reflect on some of this information I'm going to share with you in a second. So one of the research projects that we did with him, it's called educational pipeline studies. So I do these kind of quantitative data analyses as well. And I look at, you know, for every 100 students that start in P12, how many will graduate high school, how many will go on to attain a bachelor's degree, and how many will pursue and complete graduate studies. So I do these kind of data profiles. I'm going to share a few of you. I just recently did these for Washington State. So this kind of shares with you, and I'm going to kind of explain all these numbers in front of you. This is data broken down by different ethno-racial groups, and we can trouble those ethno-racial groups, and I'll share a little bit. The census is problematic for lots of different reasons, but they give us a sense of what's happening in terms of these different communities. And they're broken up, you know, and again, we should trouble how the census denotes gender. We wanted to look at the different experiences between men and women. And again, that leaves out a lot of folks who don't identify along the gender binary, and we should trouble that as well. But as we look at this data, you know, we start to see patterns emerge across the different groups. And we can see that, you know, not everybody's graduated at the same rate from high school. Not everybody's going on in the same rate to complete a bachelor's degree, and then so forth in graduate school and professional and the doctorate, that there are disparities. Now we know this is nothing necessarily new. And we also know that for Latinx students, they're the least likely to complete, to matriculate the post-secondary level compared to other ethno-racial groups. And this has been a consistent pattern, not just in Washington State, but across the US. We can also look at this data and look at it across citizenship and know that citizenship clearly impacts, even among Latinos, right? It impacts educational attainment. And so we can look at, you know, if you're a US born Latinx, you know, you have 85 of you will go on to complete high school for every 100 that starts. Whereas if you are considered not a citizen, 41 students will complete high school. That's a big difference between those two categories. And across the board, and the next one I look at income, right? Again, the pattern holds true. Like we also have to look at class. We have to look at things intersectionally and to make sense of like, what are these patterns in the data that we see? Now I share this because, as I was doing this data, I'm like, okay, Danny, you know, as we think about, so I look at this, how are we going to fix the leaks in the pipeline? Because there are so many leaks that we see here. And like, you know, what is our task as those of us who seek racial and social justice? How do we fix these leaks? And I'm going to get back to that image in a second. So one of the things that he said to me, he's like, trust the community to help you figure this out, right? That this isn't just a Vero design solution. You know, this is we have to think collectively about these questions. So I shared some of this data here in Washington State with some of our local tribal leaders. And I'll never forget, I shared this and I talked about the educational pipeline. And there was a teacher in the room and she stood up and she's like, Vero, you know, I really appreciate you sharing this data with us. It really begins to help us think about this and trouble some of it as well. But let me ask you a question. And she said, you know, what salmon wants to swim through a pipeline? And I had to pause, right? Because I had assumed that in my theory of change, the goal was to figure out how to get students through the pipeline. I never actually troubled the pipeline itself. And so when she asked that question, she's like, where is your theory of change? If your theory of change is simply to to fix the pipeline, then do you ever trouble that maybe the pipeline is the reason there's leaks in the first place? Maybe it's about how we deconstruct schooling altogether and think about a very different approach to how we deal with this, right? It's similar in some ways too, and I know you've seen this image, and for good reason it's been troubled, but there's, I mean, this floats around a lot in a lot of spaces where we talk about the difference between equality and equity, for example, and we say, okay, well, you know, if the goal isn't equality, but it's equity. But let me pause here. When you look at an image like this, what do you think someone who adopts the equity lens, what do you think their theory of change is? What solutions might they take up to achieve equity? So go ahead in the chat box and go ahead and you know, respond, and you know, what do you think their theory of change is? I want to hear your thoughts. So someone who's trying to achieve equity based on this image, what do you think they're trying to fix? And how would they fix it? Maddie, go ahead, and as people are sharing out.
Yeah, some of the thoughts that I'm getting is give everyone the same resources regardless of who they are. Integration, give additional resources to individuals instead of getting rid of the barrier or the wall that is in their way.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah, and I think part of what do you think is missing from this? If we're going to get to a more radical or critical form or a more radical vision of a theory of change, I think some of you already named it, like, you know, how we, you know, instead of giving the boxes, why not just remove the barrier? But what might be other ways that we might make this a little bit more critical to get at the deeper reasons why there is a disparity in the first place?
Yeah, we're getting more comments. It says, look at the different intersectionalities, missing the liberation of all people. They are fixing the foundation on which the problem is based, and age.
Very good, very good. So you begin to ask these questions like, well, what about this? And, you know, how are we making sense of different, what we call social locations? And that means like, not just identity based on race, but also gender, sexuality, age, ability, you know, all these different things. How does that impact the way that this sort of unfolds, right? One of my biggest things is we often don't think about this historically, right? So we can look at equality and equity, but reality is something very different, right? So like this image actually begins to give us a more true picture of what's really happening, right? Because we haven't historicized, when we think of equity, how do we put that in the context of history to look, well, what's happened over time? Is it really about closing gaps, or is it about how we remedy debts? Because there's a debt that's owed to particular students in particular communities as a result of educational policy that's denied them access to educational opportunities. So what can that look like, you know, and how do we make sense of it? So how do we put this in the context of history? And some of you've named it, you know, what if we remove the fence? Or yeah, I've had students say things like, why are they even at a baseball game? like why does that even matter? Like, why are they even here, right? Maybe we need to trouble the baseball game period. Why are they on the outside? Like, who gets to play baseball? Like all these questions, right? And I think what I'm trying to get at is that for a lot of our organizing work and efforts, we oftentimes only see the symptoms of a problem. Let me give you another example. There's been a lot of push across the state and other places to abolish police in schools, which I think is a good move, right? But what prevents the state or what prevents schools from replacing those police with something else? So you remove a police, but we never actually got rid of the carceral state that is schooling, right? You've heard the school to prison pipeline, for example, or the school to prison nexus that we're now talking about in schools. We actually didn't get rid of the prison-like state of schools. So we can remove police, but now what we're hearing of, for example, at the School of Education is how are we going to prepare teachers to take that place? In other words, beginning to train teachers to actually act like quasi-police in schools. So our efforts as an organizer have to ask a deeper question. What's the symptom of an issue? And fundamentally, what is my theory of change that's going to get at the deeper disease, the deeper structural conditions that are informing what I'm seeing, right? And so I ask these questions often because I think it's important that sometimes we have to just, our task right now is simply to say we're going to abolish police. But the next task is to say, okay, how do we remove the entire carceral state of schooling? And to always keep that in mind as we engage in leadership work. So again, what is our theory of change? And here I go to the work of Eve Tuck and Kei Wang Yang. For those of you who are really interested, there's a citation below. You want to read some of their work, who talk a lot about theory of change as well. And they say, you know, we use the words of theory of change to refer to beliefs or assumptions about how social change happens, is prompted, or is influenced, which time and human energy is invested in various political activities. But how is it that that change really happens? This is a question that communities and individuals may never ask themselves, or may have to ask themselves again and again. And I say that because as someone who is in her 40s now, you know, I'm constantly looking to the students in my classes, young people in our communities, to remind me that I also have to be willing to learn alongside you all, to continue to push my thinking, because what was working for me 10, 15 years ago in terms of my theories of change have to be always radically pushed and shifted. So again, I want you to think about this first lesson, you know, what is your theory of change and how does it impact the leadership work that you do? Now let me move on to the next lesson. And the next lesson is, it's not just what you know, but how you came to know it. And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more about popular education. And I'm going to share more specifically, and here I want to pay specific homage to the mothers that I had the opportunity to work with. Now, I share this picture with you all with their permission. Many of the women that are in this picture are identified as undocumented, and there's always a risk of disclosure. So that I always, before I share a picture of you, I always talk to them and I say, you know, what is it, you know, I want to share your story with them and have them really kind of also reap the benefits of the lessons of popular education that you all taught me. But there's always a risk, right? But they're excited about the space, and they're excited that their teachings and their mentorship is going to also be enjoyed by you all, and hopefully you can take something away from that. But this was in La Casita. This was a space in my hometown of Pasadena, California, where we met Friday nights, and we had different kinds of workshops, and we had different conversations. We did literacy campaigns, we organized. And so I still consider many of these, including the babies and the youth in this picture, my teachers and mentors, who taught me so much about what's required to enact change. And I have to share a story because it's a funny one, and because it's just, yeah, it kind of also helps us to remind us that, again, we need to amplify who can write curriculum. So I had nominated this incredible group for a big award in our field of educational research, and it's our big conference. We have a big conference every year that the folks in the academy often go to, and I always say it's a lot of where people, like, you know, think that they're, you know, dress all PPD's nice and think that like they're the gran cacas, going to a lot of these things, where I try to like challenge that, because I think professors can be really elitist in a lot of ways. But anyway, I nominated them for an award known as the Paulo Freire Award, and I'll talk a little bit about Paulo Freire in a second and popular education. But thinking, well, we'll see what happens. We'll see if they get the award. And sure enough, this organization awarded these mothers the Paulo Freire Social Justice Award, which is a very, it's a very big deal. So we're in Pasadena, and the conference that year is in New Orleans. And I was like, híjole, okay, so I have to figure out how I'm gonna fundraise, you know, like to buy maybe 2 plane tickets for the mothers that can fly, and we could figure this out. And Connie, who's in the middle of the photo, the one in blue, said to the, ay, mija, no, we all wanna go. She's like, todas queremos ir a New Orleans. And I was like, okay. And I was like, okay, how are we going to do this? Like, no te preocupes. I have a 15-passenger van. We can fit 24 people. We can drive to New Orleans. And I was like, you do realize New Orleans is not like the next city, right? Like New Orleans is many states away. And so it's like, no, we can make this happen. So sure enough, we got her car ready, and we drove 40 hours to New Orleans so they can receive this award. And when I remember we got there, we drove 2 days straight. We just rotated the driver, and we just got to New Orleans. And I was so tired. I'm like, okay, Vero needs a bath. Vero needs a little bit of a nap. And las mamás, no, like, we have to take advantage of the conference. And so they launched right into the space. And we walked into a panel presentation, and I'll never forget, La Señora Oliva. Where's La Señora Oliva? She must be in here. Oh, there she is, in the black behind Connie. And we sat in the back, and we sat down just as this scholar was basically saying to the audience, so I've conducted the study on Latinx in the US, and basically if you're uneducated, your child's going to be uneducated too, and ends his comments with that. And I remember seeing La Señora Oliva, she's like, just wait for the Q&A, right? And so as soon as the Q&A opened up, La Señora Oliva said, well, someone's gonna translate here for me. And she said, look, I am that prototype of the person that you just named as being uneducated. And here we are, un grupo de madres que somos luchadoras, que hemos trabajado, you know, we've been fighting for these issues, and you know, I do not consider myself uneducated, and all of our children are not uneducated. And she just disrupted this person's theoretical premise in ways that never happens at these conferences. And she did that at every single panel. Like, she disrupted this notion of like, whose truth are you telling? Whose lives are you explaining? And ultimately, toward what end, right? There's another panel we went to, was on Latinx family involvement. And I'll never forget, Connie was the one that said this to me. And she was, after the presentation, she's like, "Ay, mija, I could have told you that. But nothing was fancy about what they said," right? And sure enough, during the Q&A, opens up and says to the panelists, she's like, "Okay, you've done all this beautiful research on our communities, but have you actually gone back to those communities and shared about, you know, what you found and how you're going to support those movements for change?" None of them had. And her next question then was, "Then what's the point of your work?" Right? Now, they did this consistently throughout the conference, and to the point where on the way back, they're like, who says we can't be researchers too, right? Who says that we can investigate the kinds of things that matter to us, and that we can author our own histories and in our own ways, right? And do something that's more meaningful for the work we do in our local communities. Now, I share that with you because this is a group of madres, of luchadoras that were part of my journey, and who taught me that so much isn't just about what we hear. It's also about how we come to know those things, how we come to know that reality. And that if we can actually interrupt the what they call the pedagogy, the ways we design curriculum and the kinds of ways we learn, then we have a chance to actually transform educación to be something so much more radical and so much more capable of creating change in our communities. So like I mentioned, they drew specifically from Paulo Freire. For those of you who are interested, I would highly recommend. It takes a bit to get through this book. I'm gonna be honest. La Pedagogy of the Press is not an easy read, okay? If you understand Spanish and you can read Spanish, I would recommend the Spanish version. It's much better than the English translation. But nonetheless, Paulo Freire was a very big, in reading this book with the mamas, was a very big task that we had, because for Freire makes very clear that education is not a neutral process. You know, what you learn in school is reflective of somebody's interests, and that somebody is usually very old, very white, and very male, right? And so the canons that we come to learn about, even about ourselves, are filtered through that lens. And so Paulo Freire was about, how do we build curriculum from the ground, from the things that people need to know to engage a more active, a more activist, a more, I don't know if he would use the term socially just, but liberatory world, right? And so he talked about, can we make education the practice of freedom? And so I highly recommend you pick this up, but I also know that for me, every time I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I learn something new, because it's like, oh, that's what he meant. It takes a while to get through it, but he provides something really rich. And for the mothers, this is really important. So they took this to really develop this notion of critical pedagogy. So let me stop right here. Let me ask you a question. So these are some big terms, right? And I always kind of laugh when I share this, because actually underneath these terms, it's something so much more simplistic. So let me start first by saying, when you hear the term critical, what does that mean to you? Because we use that word quite a bit. When we say critical, what does that mean to you? So go ahead and add in the chat box, and Medi, whenever you're ready, go ahead and share out. I'm curious what critical means to you.
Some of the responses we're getting says important or crucial, ASAP, right now, challenge, questions, urgent, something with great importance.
Very good.
Critical thinking, like thinking outside of the box. Instant, always changing and being challenged. Critical.
Very good.
Or analytical, yeah.
Excellent. You are
Yeah.
on fire. Yeah, because sometimes we think that critical, can mean to just critique, right? And in some ways we are critiquing, right? We're trying to get at the surface. We're trying to not accept truth just because someone told us it was truth. We're trying to really understand what that means. But critical is really seen below the surface, right? In the context of Freire's world, he would say, critical is, we have to understand the political meanings underneath what we see and what we're told. So I would argue, like, thinking critically involves more than just inquiring. Oh, that should be new information. That's a little typo. In order to determine what facts are true and which are false, it involves determining the social, historical, and political underpinnings of meaning given to those facts, right? And I would say, and I would say that for us, becoming critical is becoming conscious of this political and economic landscapes that gives rise to the conditions in which we live. So, oftentimes I think about, I grew up, and we can definitely have a whole other session about what it means to grow up in a very Catholic home. But I remember for me, I grew up thinking, I would hear my mom say, pues así lo quiso Dios, right? That's how, this whole idea of like the conditions that people live in, the socioeconomic realities that we found ourselves in, especially for my parents who were new immigrants to the US, que así lo quiso Dios. That's how God wanted it, right? And I think that what critical in this context means, it's like, wait a second, there were actually there was a particular setup that led to the conditions that led some people to experience poverty and others to experience wealth. And so again, part of the task is to understand that, because as organizers, again, we need to understand like what's really at stake. What informs the conditions that the communities that we're seeking to serve through our work are facing. Because people will do this, and again, society seeks, this US society in particular, seeks to really blame individuals for these realities. So what does it mean to get underneath that and really understand what are the political and economic reasons that led to some of this, right? So that's what for me critical means. Now, similarly, let's think about pedagogy. So when you hear the word pedagogy, what does that mean to you? So go ahead and add to the comment box. What does pedagogy mean to you? And I hear a very cute bird in the background, which I love.
That's my bird. Okay, some of the responses we're getting, it says mind, ways of learning. Okay. Teaching ways of learning, teaching ways of understanding.
Very good, very good.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
Another second.
Those are all the responses. Maybe this one is a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, this is a little, because it's a term that, oftentimes my sister would be like, you academics and your terms, right? But actually pedagogia or pedagogy is actually a term that doesn't come out of the academy. It comes out of very particular grassroots movements. And I'll share why, right? So when we think of pedagogy, and again, I think about, the other thing about this I'll share in a second, that we all should in this room and in the work that you do, we should all see ourselves as educators. Again, not just because you went to a teacher ed program, or you become a teacher, you're all teachers and you're all educators. But for me, and I think I draw this specifically from the organizing work, that pedagogy isn't just about how a teacher teaches. It's about all the visible and invisible kind of human interactions between a teacher and a learner. So imagine these things. So for me, it's like, how many of you are in classrooms where, let's talk about your traditional schools, where you're in classrooms where you sit in rows. How many of you sit in rows and you're just facing a teacher? Is that pretty common? Yeah. So let's think about that. There's a message that's being sent there. It may not be explicit. Your teacher may not be telling you this, but the message is being sent that there's only one expert in the room, and that the rest of you are here to listen to one expert. In some ways, we could argue the same is being done here, even though we're trying to create an interactive environment to the extent that we can. But the reality is it's communicating something to you. How many of you had to stand in rows based on gender when you were going through school? The boys' line and the girls' line, right? It's communicating something to you. These are the more invisible or hidden curriculum that you're being taught about what it means to be a good person in the world, right? Again, they may not be explicit lessons, but they're definitely lessons that you're learning throughout your life about what it means to be moral, right, and good. And we never question it. We, until we get into a place where we're like, wait a second, that's not quite the way I see the world, but it's the way I was taught to see the world and the impacts that has on us, right? So pedagogy is about how do we learn to interrupt and see what is the hidden curriculum that's around us. And this is true, especially in organizing work as well. Organizing has particular kinds of hidden curricula, and we can unpack that further. So I want us to think about pedagogy as more than just learning content. It's also about how we read the world. So, I say pedagogy is to good interactive teaching and learning in the classroom, as critical pedagogy is to good interactive teaching and learning in the classroom and in the world. So part of our task, I think, as educators, especially if we go into organizing work, is how do we help folks understand and read their world better? Read their world much more critically to understand what's really at stake in this, right? So I think of critical pedagogy, and again, this is going to be important as we go through an example in a second, that it's the constant interaction between action, activism, reflecting on those actions and what they're really, the theory of change that we're really trying to unpack, and the knowledge we need to make sense of the world and why we're acting in this way. So for me, I think about it like, we were organizing around immigration reform and around school educational policies in California. We had to understand we had to create a sort of knowledge base to understand, okay, what are these policies really about? How do we make sense of them, right? And then as we work to interrupt them through our action, we were constantly reflecting on our theories of change to say, are we actually making change? Are we actually disrupting what we need to disrupt to move a more progressive campaign forward? And this was constantly, so knowledge, reflection, and action were constantly a part of our work in critical pedagogy. And constantly, las mamás got so good at reading people's and again, that's that hidden curriculum, reading school board meetings, reading when they went into different spaces and being, okay, who are the power players? How do I understand this context? How do I make sense of it? And so that required us building a learning community to make sense of and to really struggle with some of the things that were happening and why they were happening. And that's why, again, building that foundation in terms of knowledge was also really important. So we often hear the word, how many of you have heard the word praxis? Has that come up at all in any of your organizing work? We hear praxis. So I would say that critical pedagogy is praxis, right? To me, those two things are very much aligned. And those two things in combination form what I call popular education. So popular education comes out specifically out of movements in Latin America, and their grassroots movements in which schooling was completely built off what communities felt they needed to know. So it's done through struggle. It's connected explicitly to movement building. So, and I'm going to share an example of La Escuela en Chiapas, La Escuelita en Chiapas, Zapatistas that are doing some of this work, and to show what comes out of, what kinds of curriculum come out of popular education when you're actually rooted in the everyday lives of people and not in what the state deems to be necessary knowledge. So let me show you an example, and I'm going to come back. Actually, let's do this first, and I'll come back and I'll show you an example, because La Escuela Zapatista shows us, I think, what happens when we go through a process of popular education, and how that curriculum can then shape future generations of students. But the general process of popular education, then I want us to think about how we can adapt this to the work that you're doing. So like youth-led movements in Washington, how could this be adapted? So the first thing that we do in the process of popular education is we start by first understanding what is our reality. So for those of you, depending on the movement or the type of organization or campaign that you're a part of, you really want to understand the conditions of what is the reality that people are experiencing. So, I know that we've been my partner's been doing some stuff particularly around farm workers. He's an attorney, and he does civil rights work, and so we're often talking about, okay, what are the issues? What are the farm working conditions that are current in Washington State? How do we make sense of that reality? Not from what the state is saying is important, but what are farm workers saying that's important to them? What are the conditions that help us make sense of that? So we have to find tools that help us assess that reality. The second is we have to identify generative themes. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to show you an example by what that looks like. So for the mothers, they were very much involved in these campaigns around educational reform. So they were constantly thinking about what temas, what themes help to capture our everyday lives. So one of them was around these kind of for example, I don't know if it's here as much in Washington, but I know in California, the police would create checkpoints right around schools. So when mothers would drop off their children, the police would be sort of waiting, and if you didn't have a driver's license, they would pick up your car, right? So checkpoints became a generative theme. Otro tema was bilingual education was another big theme. Many of the mothers also wanted to talk about gender and the way that gender, for them in particular, oftentimes gets swept under the rug when we talk about, racial justice reform or ethnicity as the only category through which we have to think about these things. So they identified these generative themes. Then we think of codes. What best represents that theme? And again, I'm going to go through an example so it'll make more sense as I go through it. And those codes, so they would have different images that would represent each of the themes that they would come up with. And those images became the starting point for building a curriculum. In that process, las mamás hablaban, right? They would take the theme and the code and they would start talking about, okay, how do we trouble what we're seeing in our everyday lives? How do we make sense? We would begin to ask each other questions around these particular topics and issues. And then lastly, they would start beginning to, they would identify what are some possible solutions. So popular education doesn't start by saying, here's the problem, here's a solution. It goes through an entire curricular process to identify what are the issues, what are the thematic categories, and then begins to develop codes and curriculum to help us make sense of those conditions. So this is where I was saying before, un currículo, if we do currículo para la acción, it's so essential, especially in popular education work, to think about, the curricular aspect of organizing. So let me walk you through an example. So this is an example of a código, a code. Now I'm going to show this image. Now I want you to just think about one or two words that come to mind when you see this image, and go ahead and put them in the chat box. And I'm going to show you how this process works. So what do you see?
Boxed and fire, liberty. I see limitations to freedom. Reach for American dream. Liberty boxed in the American dream, in quotes. Equality, but no equity.
Excellent. So the thing is, you can imagine different groups different groups of individuals seeing an image like this and having a very different response. For example, if we were to show this, we talk about this, and this is now, I mentioned before that most of our work was around campaigns around education reform and immigration reform. So we were primarily working with migrant communities around popular education. So as I think about myself, even though I was born in the US as a child of immigrant parents, like my parents would read this and be, claro, the American dream, in comillas, in quotes, right? Or we would say, the myth of the American dream. Other groups, if we were doing this to a group of youth, especially right now, post, as we think about, post of a lot of the mobilizations that happen for Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd, like they might read this very differently, right? They might read that in very particular ways based on their understanding of their reality and how this reads and maps onto their, their experience. So, but the reason that this is important, why we have these códigos, is because it allows us to open up a certain way for people to engage in making sense of the myths, the ideologies, the politics that undergird how we understand U.S. society. Everybody's going to read this differently, and that's okay. Popular education isn't meant to be that everyone's going to have the same standard curriculum. What we're arguing is that these códigos help us to create curriculums that we can adapt in our movements to get at the underpinnings of what informs them, if that makes any sense. Here's another example. I know a lot of you are students, so when you see this código, what do you see? Go ahead and put it in the chat box.
While people get ready to send more, I got some from the previous one, and it said people see going to the freedom but not making it, no way to get to the top. People try to reach liberty without equity. And then for this one, it says lack of jobs, resources after education. I see folks who study like what they have been told, but there's no pathway afterwards. Got the dream, now what? The reality of academia, not always supporting BIPOC.
Very good, very good.
College is expensive.
Very good. And it doesn't always translate, right? Like, you get into this debt and there's no guarantee actually of a job, right? And so, but we're sold that myth, right? We've peddled that myth in school. What do teachers tell you when you're going through school? They tell you things like, well, what are some of the messages you hear about college? Anybody, go ahead and put in the chat box. I'm curious, what are some of the messages that you've heard or that you've been told?
There was another one that came in. It says reality of undocumented folks in academia. Just asking, which college do you plan to go to? What you learn in college does not reflect real life. Higher education equals more money. College is the pathway to success. You're paying my tuition, question mark, is the way out.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I remember one of the most basic messages I got told when I was going through elementary school was like, if you work hard, you can accomplish any of your dreams, right? Did you hear that? That was the quote unquote American dream. So, you know, if you work hard, you can do anything. If you, you know, you can get to college, and you get to college, you get a degree, and what, you'll have a good life, right? This is, I mean, we've been told this, right? So the goal was to get to college, but what happens, right? For so many of our college graduates that, first of all, there's no guarantee of a job, and we're seeing that play out. They're sort of drowning in debt. That's one thing. Also, we don't tell students, like, for example, in California, which is where I'm from, we've only actually built enough seats for 1/16 of the population that's currently in high school to actually go to college. So somehow along the way, we have to weed out 15/16 of the rest of the student population. But we don't tell them that. We don't tell them that it's actually been structured that, so that only 1 out of every 16 actually has a seat. We actually don't have any more space for anybody else. But we don't tell students that. So we peddle this myth that tells them, like, as long as you work hard, you can accomplish anything. And so part of this exercise through popular education is to take an image like this and problem pose it and say, how do we understand what, you know, when we see these things, what does it make you feel? What are the things you see in it? But also, how do we get at the political and economic and social reasons that led to this moment? It's not a coincidence that young people are protesting, that young people are questioning the value of a college degree, not because of its economic benefits, but also because of its social benefits. Like, what is it really giving us? And I also say that as somebody who has more college degrees than I can probably count, right? So I am a walking contradiction. But I think about these ways in which popular education helps us to understand, okay, if we actually want to construct an education that's more socially and racially just, we want to build other kinds of communities that are pushing us toward movements, then what needs to happen? And this helps us to kind of unearth our theories of change, right? By going through this process. And the design of this is designed actually to create a curriculum. It's designed to capture codes and themes to share with other young people. In this case, this was designed to target, obviously, college-age youth. The previous example showed, like, images that the mothers were using for organizing with other mamas and other families. So each of these had a place in helping us make sense of, okay, what's really at stake? Is it, you know, if we're going to do campaigns for educational reform, is it really about making sure that our kids work harder, or have, you know, that they should be more resilient? Or is our campaign about making sure that they don't have to be resilient at all, that we can remove the structures that require them to be superhuman just to be, right? And so these are the kinds of ways in which popular education works to help us make sense of those things and how we proceed. So this was the book that I was telling you about. This is the book, this is the first grade textbook, Freedom According to the Zapatistas. And let me just share with you what happens when you actually produce a popular education text. So this is first grade. So how old were you? 6 years old, maybe, right? So roughly about that age. And I want to give you a sense of these are the themes that first graders are learning in Chiapas. Now, just by looking at these themes, how are they different from the things that you learned in first grade? Look at the themes here. What does it reveal for you about the importance of popular education? And a popular education can actually help us construct an education that is helping us survive a world that is set on keeping us out, that is set, quite frankly, in many cases, of a state that's it's not only actively trying to keep us out, but actively trying to kill us. And so how do we make sense of a curriculum we need to survive that, to dismantle it, to transform it, to create other kinds of systems in which our lives can be fully possible? But this gives you an example, right, of, like, here are the kinds of themes that, you know, when you design a curriculum based on popular education and based on the everyday realities of people, you can actually create an education that is one that we all deserve, right? So I wanted you to just kind of see an example of what a curriculum, what text based in popular education could look like. But let me move on for sake of time. I have 2 more lessons I want to talk briefly about. The third lesson that I've learned in my organizing work, particularly around popular ed and grassroots organizing, is that we all need to embrace our contributions as organic intellectuals. And I say that, and this is a term that comes out of Antonio Gramsci, and he's a theorist that worked really closely with Freire. And he really was troubled by the fact that intellectuals traditionally are the ones that we see coming out of the academy. And really kind of pushing against that and saying that, you know, we have all kinds of intellectuals in our communities, we just don't, you know, see them as such. And I go back to the example of Connie, the mother that I shared with you in that image. I remember, and Sylvia's probably tired of me telling the story over and over again, but I love the story because it showcases just how so many in our community theorize from the flesh. and make sense of their world through these experiences. And why, as grassroots organizers, we need to build off those theories. So I remember in one of the group meetings that we had at La Casita, I remember I asked one of the mothers, and I said, you know, what has this group meant to you? This grupo de mujeres, this group, you know, what has it meant to you in your work? And I remember she said to me, very plain and simple, she's like, ay, mija, it's simple. She's like, no más atole con el dedo. And for those of you who don't know dichos, dichos there's everyday sayings, we have them in many communities, but I grew up with dichos. They're just kind of like these sometimes coded phrases that we grow up going like, mis papás me dieron un dicho, and I'm not really sure, but there's an important lesson in there somewhere. But that was sort of the pedagogy of the home, so to speak. And so when she told me this dicho, the other mothers were like, sí, mija, eso es, that's it. That's the answer to your question. And I was like, wait a second, I need you to explain what this means, because no más atole con el dedo directly translates into no more atole with the finger. And you're like, what does that really mean? And atole is, it's a Mexican-based drink made out of flour. For those of you that have had atole, I'm sure that many of you on this call have, but you know, and so when I asked this mother to explain to me, I said, okay, explain to me what you mean by that. She's like, okay. She's like, when you're a breastfeeding parent, there comes a point where you just get tired and you don't want to breastfeed anymore. And so you make atole and you rub atole on the baby's lips to give you a break, to pacify the baby, to trick the baby so that, that they calm down, so it gives you a break from breastfeeding. And she says, that's what the school district has been doing to us all these years. So this organization is, we will no longer be fooled. This organization is basically no más atole con el dedo. We will no longer be fooled or tricked into deceit for real reform. Now, I remember in that moment when she said that to me, I was like, you in 5 words just theorized power, resistance, possibility, like all the things I had learned in like 4 years of my PhD program, you said in one dicho, right? And you theorized directly from a lived experience of saying, this is something that I experienced as a breastfeeding parent. And I know that analogy when it comes to the district, that they're tricking us, they're trying to fool us, and that we will no longer be, this organization will no longer tolerate that kind of deceit. And I was blown away. I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And I remember just thinking to myself, like, this is you know, Connie and Vero and Oliva, they're organic intellectuals, and they're pushing us to think about different things. I also want to share these are my parents. I haven't talked to them about them too much. They were also I consider them my organic intellectuals, the people that I've learned from. I mentioned the pedagogy of the home. So my mother, Águeda Nelida Díaz Gutiérrez, my father, Humberto Rutia Vélez, both immigrants. I swear they're a lot happier than they look in this picture. When I was graduating from college, I don't know why they're so serious, but anyway, but this is, you know, I oftentimes talk about you know, with students at Western that, you know, they taught me what it meant to be bien educada. And being bien educada, being well educated, wasn't just something you had in terms of degrees. And my mom reminds me this every time I go home. She's like, I don't care how many degrees you have, you can still be muy mal educada, right? And she reminds me about the importance of, and sometimes what this means for those of you who aren't familiar with the term educación in our communities, it's that it can mean when you leave the comal on, you know, to heat up a tortilla, but you don't even know who needs it, right? It means that when you're about to say goodbye, you know, it takes you more than an hour, and in that hour, you're inching closer to the door than to the car. It's about community, it's about relationships, it's about relationality, it's about caring for one another. And this for me was part of what I grew up embracing and valuing, and that is what it means to be bien educada. Now, I share this because I'm coming back to the mothers. That's a form of intellectualism that we don't see as such, and I think we need to embrace that these are important lessons that carry us forward, that are important to who we are in our worldviews. This is an image that the mothers made along with their children. Now, many of the mothers that I showed you in that picture, in terms of like society standards, couldn't read or write. Many of them couldn't sign their name. They didn't go through formal schooling back in their home countries. But they were some of the most literate people I knew. They could read and write their world in very powerful ways, and this image is proof of that. This was an activity that they do as part of their organizing strategies. It comes up, it's a puzzle, basically, a really big puzzle that they create to help people understand why competition is bad for schooling. you know, how do we collectivize around some of this reform? And so the images that you see here are images that they drew. And just based on the image that you see in front of you, what do you think the image represents? And go ahead and add in the chat box. So this is an image that they created as part of their organizing. What do you think is in this image? And why do you think that they created it? I'm curious of your thoughts.
Let's see, slaves. They created it because it's what's been affecting them the most. White guys. The history of the injustices their pueblo has been through, power to show US white-based education is not everything. Lies.
Very good. Excellent. So you all did it. I mean, you captured it, right? I mean, for them, this is how they understood U.S. history, and even more specifically, U.S. history as it pertains to schooling. So, you know, everything from understanding what oppression looks like, you know, from the time of the boarding schools and how Christianity was a part of that, of settler colonialism and all that jazz, Declaration of Independence, slavery. Then they also wanted to talk about movements, and you know, you see there. You know, different movements, United Farm Worker movements, the two little girls in the front, that was Ruby, not Ruby Payne. Ruby was a little girl that the case was fought for Brown v. Board of Education, and so integration of schools. And then the image to the left, the George Bush High School, because they drew this at the time that George Bush was president. That's how old I am. I will, as an organizer, I won't date myself anymore. But at the time, they were really struggling because the version of the DREAM Act at the time basically had a clause in it that said that it had gone through many revisions, and the latest iteration of the DREAM Act said that in order for you to actually access, you know, some form of residency through schooling, is that you had to sign up. You either, you know, go to school and, you know, get your degree, but if at any point you leave school or drop, quote unquote, drop out, then the other option would be to enlist in the military. Those were the two options that were provided at the time, and the mothers had a really hard time supporting the DREAM Act, and they really struggled with it. And they said they didn't know how to make sense of it because, you know, yes, they wanted their children to have access to a permanent sort of residency in the U.S. At the same time, they also didn't want to send their kids to the military. So it was this tension that they had to face around a particular moment. And so hence you see the image of the girl, the DREAM Act, getting her degree, but also in tears, people going into high school, falling into an abyss. This was reflecting their reality, right? And again, a really powerful image, but I share this because again, this to me shows the power of organic intellectualism and what it can offer us in terms of providing curricular tools and organizing strategies for helping to move movements forward. And this was one way that they did that. I also share this, I know Sylvia has seen this video, because I share that organic intellectuals aren't just adults. Organic intellectuals are also the youngest in our communities. So how are we, especially a lot of you are youth leaders, I think between the ages of 16 and 25, but how many of you are looking to the 5-year-olds in your community as organic intellectuals and what they can offer? So I share this quick clip because this is my, my little sobrinito who had just started TK. So this is even before kindergarten, TK, and he was, he had been in a Christmas pageant at school and had done a terrible job by all standards. Como se llama, estaba bien mal portado. He was not behaving accordingly, but we also know from early childhood education that, you know, children who are 4 and 5 shouldn't be in lines anyway. Like, it's not something that they should be doing. So when he was leaving, you know, the school, this is how he reacts, right? So I gave him una paleta, I gave him a little lollipop, and was pretty much like, you know, I love you, your tia who's going to radicalize you, don't worry. But, you know, my mom and my sister were all worried about his behavior. But here's him leaving school that day. Chapulín. Are you happy? You're leaving school for your break?
He walks out of here first. Mira, Cevita, mándale un saludo a Nino. Dile, hola, Nino, allí en el teléfono de Nino. Dile, hola, Nino, ¿cómo camina?
So I share that because even though he's only 4 years old, and even though he's just barely starting school, he already knows the joys of leaving school because of what school is doing to him, right? And so I think about, you know, what can the 4 and 5-year-olds teach us about oppression? And what can they teach us about what's needed to actually enact a more liberatory world, right? So Sebis, I always come to him because Sebis is my teacher too. He's now 6, he's just about to start 1st grade virtually. And I have to constantly ask him, you know, what kind of education do you think you deserve? What kind of education do you think you need to be more fully you, whatever that is, right? And I think this embodies for me that even the 4-year-olds are telling us something about what oppression is and how we begin to enact change. So I share that it's kind of funny because he's just so happy to leave school. I'm like, he's every kid for winter break when school gets out, right? But it's important to remember that even the 4-year-olds are organic intellectuals. I know I'm pretty much out of time, but I'm going to share this last one because I wanted to leave you with something about hope. And one of the lessons that las mamás, especially that day that we started to drive all the way to New Orleans, that las mamás, ten confianza, Vero, have confidence in us, Vero, like we can make this happen. And I wasn't as hopeful we were going to make it all the way to New Orleans, but they were. And what they taught me is how do we make critical hope the driving force of our work? But I want to be clear that not all hope is the same. Oftentimes, and I showed, these are pictures of our students at Western, and I know that Silvia and others have been a big part of also shaping my, so I wanted to honor them here too. Some beautiful students who have taught me what critical hope is, and helping me think about how do I move this work forward, that, like I said, not all hope is the same, and how do we move this forward? So these are what Western Washington University students who've been part of the education and social justice minor. Just sharing a few of those images here. But I know I'm almost out of time. I have lots of pictures. But I wanted to talk about them, right? You know, talk about hope and what I've learned from them and others. So critical hope is not hokey hope. And I draw this particularly from the work of Jeff Duncan Andrade. For those of you who might know his work, he has a beautiful piece on what it means to grow roses in concrete. And he uses Tupac as a metaphor to help us think through a more radical version of hope. So as the quote kind of, and I'll just kind of summarize here, like hokey hope is this kind of like, you know, as long as you work hard, you can accomplish anything, right? It's a quote unquote American dream. It's más ten esperanza, you know, work hard. For those of you who know the term meritocracy, like as long as, you know, it's just based on, you know, our actions that are going to get us ahead in life. He's like, that's not the kind of hope we want to give our students, right? That's a problematic hope. And it also doesn't help us understand that there are structural conditions that are impacting us, that oppression is real, that racism is real, that homophobia and xenophobia are real, right? And so we want to make sure that we're not giving them hokey hope. He also argues that we need to be careful not to give them mythical hope, where he calls it like hope on a tightrope. Now, what is mythical hope? Mythical hope is when we say things like, well, if Obama could be president, right? Anybody can, any of our, you know, Black kids can be president. If so-and-so, you know, they'll give you these examples, what are often known as the exceptional cases, right? Well, if that person can do it, then you can do it too, right? How many of you have heard that? I mean, I oftentimes get that growing up because I come home to my parents with all these critical theories and all these critical understandings. And I try to kind of critique the American dream and they're like, but mija, look, you made it. And I'm just like, you know, I get all mad at myself because I'm like, I don't want to be the exception, right? Like, that's not what this is about. And it's a problem. I think exceptionalism is an issue, even though oftentimes we can pride ourselves on saying like, we are the one in our family who went on and got a college degree, but who does that leave out? I think this is why so many undocumented students in particular now are pushing against the dreamer narrative. It's like, what does it mean when we can't be peddling mythical hope like this, right? And the dreamer narrative can do that, right? It can put people as in this exceptional category that leaves out a whole host of people. So we want to be careful about mythical hope, right? And this is kind of that idea. The third, and this is something that I would say my generation for sure is doing more of, is this notion of hope deferred. And hope deferred is when we say, ¿sabes qué? I'm never going to see the things I worked so hard for, so I'm going to defer my hope to the next generation. This is where we oftentimes become really complacent. We say, "Híjole, the problem is so big and we need a revolution and that's never going to happen. So you know what, why bother even trying?" So we defer our hope to the next one. And we say, it's, you know, we're going to leave it up to them to try to do it. And this is not the kind of hope we want to peddle either, you know, because again, as educators, as grassroots organizers, we want to think differently about what does it mean to engage in solidarity with our communities and work alongside them and collectivize hope, you know, toward this hope and enactment of that desire. So what we argue is that we need to think about critical hope. And critical hope for me is really important. And it's, and I would say that this is where we talk about, in the best sense of the word, things like solidarity, things like radical healing, spaces where we say we may not know the answer, but I'm willing to struggle alongside you to figure out what that answer is. That's a form of critical hope. And it's about being honest with our students, not, you know, masking for them the dangers and the conditions, but working with them to figure it out. I say, you know, I always tell my students every day at Western, I go, I love you all. I have such love for you. And because I love you, my pedagogy of love is one that is not just committed to making you resilient, because I know you're resilient, but it's about dismantling the conditions that require you to be resilient at all. I want you just to be happy and joyful, right? What would that mean as an educator and as an organizer to say that in solidarity, I'm not just here to continue to, I mean, resistance is always going to be a part of our work, but what does it also mean to dismantle the conditions that required us to resist at all? Like, why do we always have to be in constant struggle, right? That's a solidarity. That's a commitment to work in our communities in a very different way and toward a very different hope. It also is about making sure that we don't, you know, we cannot treat our students as other people's children. Their pain is our pain. Now I think about it in the context of as an educator, but I think about it in the context of you all as being youth leaders. You know, what does it mean to embody this? I mean, if we're not from particular communities, but you're working in solidarity, how do you not co-op, right? Those movements or those spaces, but at the same time, what does it mean to say, I also struggle, these movements are also about my liberation too. And how do I link those things in solidarity around that? So anyway, I wanted to end here, but I wanted to just kind of, you know, again, those 4 lessons for me. The first one being mindful. What is our theory of change? How do we think about that in our organizing work? The second is about, it's not just what you know, but how you came to know it. How do we make explicit pedagogical commitments and thinking about the possibility of popular education, for example, in our organizing work? The third one is about making sure all of us walk away today feeling like we are organic intellectuals. We all have something to offer. Even those of us in our communities who we have deemed to not be intellectual are probably the most intellectual in the context of popular education. So how do we bring them into the fold and help to see them as such and contributing key knowledge to move our work forward? And the last one is, again, thinking about how do we embody critical hope and how does that drive the work we do on the daily? And it has to be, right? And how do we make that possible? So anyway, thank you for listening to me today. I have such tremendous gratitude and love for all of you and for the organizers especially. And I will open it up for more Q&A. I'll stay on here as long as you all need me to continue the conversation. But anyway, thank you all for this time.
Thank you, Doctora Vero. If you all would help me give Doctora Vero a round of applause, you can use your reactions and clap. That was amazing. Thank you. There was so much to learn in there. So what we're planning on doing is using the next 10 minutes or so, depending on the amount of questions we receive, to do a little Q&A. If you have any questions for Doctora Vero, please be sure to send them to questions/comments, ask me, and then Mary will be reading them out loud.
Yes. Okay, so we do have a few questions here, and feel free to send any other questions to me. So the first question we have here for you, Doctora Vero, is what advice do you give first-generation students who are wanting to go to grad school?
So the first thing I would say to first-generation students that are thinking about grad school is don't look, well, the very first thing I would say is, what are you hoping that grad school will help you answer? So oftentimes we think about, and I remember having this moment when I was applying to grad school and asking myself, okay, what degree do I want, or what field do I want to go into? And I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we want grad school to answer? Thinking about the question, not the degree, is the first thing, because you can actually take a particular question It can be answered in a very specific way through like sociology, or it can be answered in a very specific way through education, or even like Chicanx or, you know, women's studies. They all offer very different, but you can ask the same question. So we want to start there, is thinking about, okay, what are the things that you really want to know, and why grad school? The second advice I would give is, don't follow the program, follow the mentor. Now that can be really tough, because you're like, where do I start? How do I know which, you know, professor or mentor? But this is why, you know, so because it's oftentimes a program. How many of you have actually, I mean, let me think about it in the context of courses. How many of you have taken courses that sound really good on paper, and then once you actually take the class, you're like, this is really bad. This is really terrible. Because, you know, because again, all these universities and grad programs are going to market themselves really good online. They're going to tell you all the things you want to hear, but you don't really know if that's actually how it's going to be in real, in reality. So you want to get to know, like, if you find particular programs online, you're like, okay, this sounds really good, but who are the faculty? Who are the people in those programs? And don't be afraid. Like, I know, like, part of how I got into UCLA is I looked at some programs back home. I'm like, okay, I want to be back home in LA, and started poking around. And then I came across Danny, and then I reached out to him, and I'll never forget that very first meeting. I remember walking into his office, and I remember I only had like 15 minutes with him. And I was so nervous because I had done so bad as an undergrad. And I was like, no one's going to want me. No one's going to want me to go back to school. And so I found him, and I had a list. I had a little agenda, and he stopped me, and he's like, no. He's like, tell me, where's home for you? Tell me, where did you grow up? And I never had a teacher care about my family, my home, who I was. And we spent about we ended up going for about an hour, but we ended up spending this time where he got to, like, he wanted to know me. Like, I'm like, what teacher wants to know me? And I already knew from that moment I wanted to work with him, right? It was a mentor who cared about me, who I knew was invested in me, not just as a student, but as a person, who really was, and he did. He was a mentor that did everything to make sure that I had the fellowships, that I had the right training, that he was, he understood when, you know, one of the things he told me, I'll never forget, when I was working on my projects, he's like, I want you to write this in such a way so that your dad can read it. Oh, gosh, you know, like, that was so powerful, right? Where he's like, I want you to title your chapters with dichos. I don't want you to have to translate the Spanish if you don't want to. Like, write it so your father can appreciate what you're writing. Again, that's not something you hear very often in the academy. So I would say, like, you know, do your research and work around the mentors. And then once you find the right mentor, that, you know, it may be in a program that you might have not expected, but that's going to be the right fit for you. And especially for first gen, you really want a mentor that's going to support you, that's going to give you the hidden curriculum of the academy, right? The things that nobody teaches you, how to play the game, and how to, you know, challenge the game, and how to kind of maneuver through the game. And that's what my mentor did for me. I'm also, for those students that are really wanting to, who are thinking about applying to grad school, and I can be of support, don't hesitate to reach out. I left my email there, and also the organizers, feel free to share my contact information to everybody. I feel like one of the things that one of the few things that I pride myself on is that I feel like I do really well in supporting students in the grad school application process. So if that's something you're really interested in, let's talk. And we can, I can definitely point you to particular mentors or programs that might be a good fit for you. But those are like some key advice.
Awesome. And actually, can you by chance drop your contact information on that chat box?
Sure. And I realized that there were different things in the chat that I did not see. I apologize. I'll have to make sure I follow up.
You're fine. And another question that we have here for you is, when you were organizing the moms, what was the biggest takeaway, and what advice would you give us?
The biggest takeaway from organizing with the moms?
Mm-hmm.
God, there were so many. I have so many, I have so many like memories. Okay, so let me share this one memory that I have that I think was a really powerful one, and it always stuck with me. So one of the memories I have is when I first started organizing with them. And I remember that I wanted so bad to be an organizer. You know, there was a moment where, you know, tenía tantas ganas. And I remember like, Vero, I remember telling myself that, you know, in 6 months, I'm going to change this entire community. Like, Vero solita is going to make everything possible. Like, I had all these visions for myself that were really problematic at the time, right? Because I had las ganas to try to create change. And now, and I remember the very first meeting that I tried to organize. It was at a school. It was in Northern California, actually. And I remember I made like 3,000 flyers. I probably made enough champurrado for like an army. I bought pan dulce, like I was, like pan dulce was coming out of my ears. I did all the things that I was supposed to do to get, that I thought could get families there so that we can really start working and in 6 months have this community turned around. And I'll never forget, only one mother showed up. Her name was Magdalena. And Magdalena, I remember, came up to me and she said to me, she's like, Mija. So it's really cute that you're really excited to change Challenge's community, but you don't know us. you don't know us. You have no clue the things that this community has been through. You think that just because you put flyers and bring pan dulce that we're just going to show up? Like, que falta de respeto, what a lack of respect, right? You have no idea how awful the school has been to us in terms of hearing our voices. Spend time getting to know us. Like, it's not about the bells and whistles. It's about how much you invest in actually building those relationships. And so I remember for an entire year, and I am not a morning person. Vero got up at like 6 in the morning to make cafecito, and I decided to get there before the parents got there. And I was outside of the school, and one of the very first things that I noticed, I said, gosh, I didn't realize that the school was completely gated. And there was like barbed wire around the top of the gates. And I thought, gosh, if I were a family at the school, this school makes me feel as if the community doesn't belong here. They don't want the community a part of the school. Like the community was almost like a danger to the people in the school. And I began to notice things and see things. I began to read the context of schooling in a very Freudian sense, like what is the reality here? And so I remember that took about a year, cada mañana, before getting to know the moms, right? After about a year, one of the moms said to me, Vero, what are you doing after the bell rings? And I said, well, I don't know, I'm gonna go inside and make myself useful, right? She's like, no, mija. She's like, I want you to come to my home. I wanna show you something. And so I remember saying, okay, so, the school started. She then took me to her home and we walked into her home and there were about 50 families in her home. And she said, just because we're not organizing at the school doesn't mean we're not organizing. She's like, but now that we know that you wanna get to know us, we're inviting you in. To the point where like soon after that, all I had to do was call one mama and I would have like 300 parents in a room, right? Because the trust in the network was already built. So one of the biggest takeaways is get to know the communities that you're organizing with. Spend the time investing. Sometimes we want to jump to fixing problems, but sometimes the best advice that I can give you is get to know them. See them as organic intellectuals. Respect their organizing practices, where they organize, how they see things. And from there, you begin to build a platform. I think oftentimes as organizers, we want to step in and because everything feels urgent, like it should have been done yesterday. But some of my Native colleagues remind me, they're like, Vero, we've been doing this since time immemorial, like since we were first colonized. So like, we got time, don't worry about it. The post-colonial vision is gonna come, but we got to continue to build the infrastructure for that. So that's one of my biggest takeaways from my organizing work, was one of that very first encounter that I had with Magdalena.
Awesome. So we do have one more question. And the question is, how can we organize in our homes or from our homes? And how could we talk to our parents about radical movements when they are conservative?
Ooh. So I will say that the biggest challenge for me is bringing this home. Like, I'll be honest. It was funny because I was just trying to get a chance to look at the comments, and I think somebody wrote like, your dad looks like an agent, no hate. My dad was a police officer, retired, and so you read my dad pretty good. And I will say that, I have so much I can share about my father in a different, people want to have more questions on my dad, but my dad, so not only was he a police officer, my dad was part of COINTELPRO. I don't know if anybody knows what COINTELPRO is, but it was counterintelligence. It's basically when the FBI and different police departments began recruiting people from our own communities to spy on movements. So my father knew Cesar Chavez really well, but as a spy. My father was Angela Davis's bodyguard for 3 years and Angela Davis had no idea, right? And I share the story of my father pretty openly now, as my father's pretty sick at this time and struggling through this stage in his life. But he oftentimes shared with me how much he regretted what had happened. But he still loved that cop life. You know, he still loved being an agent. He still loved doing these things. And I find it, for me, it's all, sometimes students get like, tripped out when I say like, yeah, the FBI paid for my education. I don't know how else to say that. I just got to be honest about it. Right? My father, the reason he went into that was because he said, I want to make sure that you and your sister will never struggle through school. Now, I share that because I think that, part of the challenge, I think a lot of the times is that we come to homes where, my father was very set in his beliefs, very set in his ways. And he was also my dad, right? And, even though there's so many things about what he did that I'm still upset about and I still struggle with, because he didn't share that part of his life until I was in grad school. I still saw him as my father, as someone who started to get sick at the end of his life. The direct result from, I would argue, from a lot of the training that he underwent when he was part of the FBI. And I saw his humanity in it. And I understood, how the state can oftentimes infiltrate our communities and find ways to make us believe that what we're doing, even when we're spying on, is actually good for us or good for our communities, when it's quite the opposite. Like, they're basically recruiting us to kill ourselves. And I say that really explicitly, because I think it's really important to know that this continues to happen today, right? And so how do we resist those ways that, the state continues to impact, us, and how do we continue to seek liberation? But the hardest task is bringing that home, like trying to convince my dad, you know what I mean? Like, who for for almost 40 years, really believed that, the state was, that we needed to assimilate. And that was really the task, or that, police work was really where it was at. And so imagine a daughter coming home and saying, abolish the police. What does that even mean for him? And how does we have very different political views. But I never gave up on my dad. And, it's funny, when I started organizing, one day I said to my dad, I'm like, Dad, because I was teaching adult literacy classes in the evening as part of the work with the mothers. And so I taught adult Spanish and adult English. And so one day I told my dad, I'm like, hey, we need another teacher. Can you come volunteer at La Escuelita, because we need another teacher, can you come? And he was reluctant at first, right? He didn't want to come. And then he started coming to La Escuelita, and literally within 6 months, he was the director of La Escuelita program. All the students loved my dad because my dad learned how to speak English as an adult. So he was able to spell for them. They're like, ay, Señor Humberto, can you write like how you would say that, but using the Spanish alphabet? For my dad, it came second nature. Like, he could write Hoover, there was an elementary school called Hoover. Like, I only know how to spell Hoover, H-O-O-V-E-R. But he quickly was like, oh, fácil, J-U-B-E-R. Ah, Hoover, right? Like, they could now pronounce it using the Spanish phonetics, but making it sound like the English word. Like, my dad was able to do that and like quickly. Like, I was like, Dad, you are a masterful teacher in helping the students at La Escuelita really learn English really quickly. And so quickly he became the favorite teacher of the entire community. And through that experience, through his own interaction, began to see things like, oh, wait a second, there's a lot of injustice. Oh, wait a second, right? And even though I could never get him to like talk about abolishing police, I was able to move him a little bit on these other issues. And I think that's part of the task, that's part of the work. How do we help our parents not come home and like hit them over the head with ideology, but how do we come home and have them realize for themselves these injustices? How do we help them create the experiences to shift their thinking around these issues? It takes time. It takes time, and it's really hard. But I know I've seen a shift with my dad. And even though I want him to be a little more radical, but I've seen his humanity, because I love my father. As much as he's complicated, he's still my dad. And I struggle with that, right? I struggle with the contradiction that he embodies. And so that's what I would say. It's, be patient, but don't give up on bringing it home. It's really important.
Thank you. Those are all of our questions.
Wonderful. So yes, I've noticed a couple of other things in the comments. I do have a LinkedIn account, but I don't check it very often. So the best way to do is to just send me an email, and I'm happy to connect with you. We can find a time to connect. So just shoot me an email and we'll connect that way. You have my word, I will do better with LinkedIn at some point. This is the 40-some-year-old Beto that is still learning new social platforms. But we'll get there. But just send me an email and we'll find some time to connect. Yeah, and just know that I'm a resource to you all. Anything that you all need, I'm happy to be here for to answer more questions, grad school, whatever. So anyway, thank you.
Yay. Thank you, Doctora Vero.